Well, I think it depends to some degree on what you mean by stronger. So physical strength is one element, and like if you look at mythological heroes, imagine that the stories of heroes are fragmented elements of the archetype. And so one kind of archetypal hero obviously is someone who's physically strong. You know, you see that there's a great movie that you could watch about this. It's called Hitman, Hart. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen, and it's about this guy named Bret Hart. And Bret Hart was for a while the most famous Canadian on the planet, and he was a worldwide wrestling foundation, I think. What do they call that? WWF? Yeah. He was their like lead good guy. And so wrestling, I loved the documentary because when I was a little kid, like 4 or 5, I used to watch his father, whose name was Stu Hart, who ran this channel, this wrestling confederation in Alberta. And Stu Hart had, I think, 8 boys, and he trained all of them to be pro wrestlers. And part of the movie is extraordinarily funny because Stu Hart is in it, and he's really old. He's like 85, and he's just barely, can you imagine? He was like a pro wrestler for 40 years. Like every joint is broken. And he's still big, but he's just barely moving. And this kid and another kid come over, and Stu is telling the story about how he used to take his boys into the basement and toughen them up. And I think Bret called that the journey to pain or something like that. His father would take all these kids down there and wrestle with them and push them right to the edge of their pain tolerance constantly. And so, and anyways, they grew up tough. There's no doubt about that. And all his daughters married pro wrestlers too, and I think he had 7 daughters. So he's quite the character. Anyways, these 2 kids, they're late adolescence, early adulthood, come over, and one of them's pretty damn cocky. And he's listening to Stu, and he says something smart like, well, you know, you were pretty tough with the old days, hey? And Stu looks at him and says, well, why don't you come down to the basement with me? And he says, well, look, I don't want to hurt you, old man. And so the filmmakers follow them into the basement, eh? And like they're kind of standing there, and the old guy grabs him in a headlock and takes him like, he's like a snake, eh? He's got him in a headlock like so fast, and the kid doesn't know what to do. And then, so Stu, like, who knows how to put a headlock on someone, he's like flexing his forearm, yeah, which is like still not so bad, a forearm. And he's got, this guy's face is just, he's like he's stepped in a bear trap, plus he's absolutely shocked that this old guy got him. And so he's kind of gasping. And Stu says something like, you watch, if I flex this muscle just right, you can see this vein on his forehead start to pop out. It's extraordinarily funny. Anyways, Bret Hart plays out the good guy archetype, and Bret's, like, he's a solid guy, but I would say he's not particularly sophisticated, and I'm not being cruel about that. I mean, he had a great career, and he's tough as a boot, and so good for him. But he plays out this good guy archetype, and he gets tangled up in it. And now, I don't remember your damn question, but I am trying to answer it. Tell me the question again.
So I was wondering how, in reality, you go from who's strongest and who's weakest to what's good and what isn't.
Oh yes, okay, exactly. Well, so one of the things I really liked about this movie was it showed me why people watched wrestling, and I couldn't because certainly they're not appealing, and I'm not being, there are different strata of conception of abstraction that any entertainment process has to appeal to. And you know, most people don't go to movies. And that's actually because, it really is because movies operate at a level of sophistication that is too high for many people. Just like novels. I mean, hardly anyone reads, you know, and if you, about 15% of the population, might be 20%, cannot read well enough to follow written instructions. And so, and people who are, maybe it's 15% of the population or 10%, have never finished a book, never. And so, and it is that high. But you still, the archetype still needs to manifest itself at different levels, and so it manifests itself in wrestling. But even there, where it is physical force, it's not just physical force. Like, it's a drama between good and evil. And you can see this so clearly in the Bret Hart documentary, because he's the good guy, and you know, the bad guys are really over the top bad. It's a real drama. It's like, it's good versus evil in the ring every time. And hopefully good wins, but good often gets, you know, maybe the bad wrestler brings 2 of his friends in, and they bring in chairs and they bash the hell out of the good guy, and the whole audience is just outraged by this. And the documentary does a lovely job of showing that. But So even at the level of physical combat, let's say, you can't reduce what's good to what's strong. It's just one element of it. Better to be strong than to be weak. And so you can have a strong hero because it's better to be strong than to be weak. But it's better to be strong and kind than to be strong. And it's better to be strong and kind and wise than to be strong and kind. And so, and that's true not only for human beings, but it's even true, let's say, at the wolf or the chimpanzee level, because one of the things you see with the chimp dominance hierarchies, and I think I mentioned this before, is if the leader, the dominant male, is really good at fostering social relations and being reciprocal in acts like grooming, and also paying attention to the females and their offspring, his dynasty will be much more stable. And so strong might be good for one battle, it might be good for 2 battles, but for 50 battles, it's not optimized. Especially because no matter how strong you are, someone can take you out. So what happens is the idea of what's ideal becomes increasingly complex across time, multifaceted, right? And so strength, wisdom, intelligence, vision, all these things are amalgamated into a single being. And we'll talk a lot about that because I want to show you how that happened in Mesopotamia, because that's one of the first places where we have documentation about how that ideal emerged. They have a god called Marduk, and Marduk had 50 names. And as far as I can tell, the reason for that was that Marduk was an amalgam of the tribal deities of at least 50 tribes. And when the tribes were brought together and civilized, each of their gods who were ideals had to be amalgamated into something that was a single dramatized representation of value, or there was no way that all those people could have lived together, right? Their different value structures would have fragmented them and they would have stayed in a state of war. And so the question is, it's the question you're asking. If it's not strength, then what is it? Well, strength is an element, but the Egyptians figured out that it was vision. It was actually the capacity to pay attention. That was paramount. And the Mesopotamians had that figured out more or less too, because their god Marduk had eyes all the way around his head. He could see everywhere. So seeing was a critical element of what should be on top. And the other thing for the Mesopotamians was the ability to speak. So by the time of Mesopotamia, people had already dramatized the idea that cardinal human attributes are vision and the ability to speak. So, and that be the ability to speak the truth too, not just speak. So Cain kills Abel. Cain's children kill 7. Cain's grandchildren kill 70-fold. And then Tubal-Cain pops up on the horizon, and he's the person who makes artifices of war. And so the story, in its fragmentary manner, ties the individual psychopathology that's resentful and revenge-seeking to the proclivity for broad-scale warfare. And this really hit me because I was interested particularly in what was happening in the Nazi camps with the guards. Because the guards were gratuitously cruel. And I was very curious about that. And so here's an interesting story. This was in a book called Ordinary Germans, Hitler's Willing Executioners. And it was a book that was written about 30 years ago that challenged the idea that the Nazi phenomena was top-down order following, which I don't believe, by the way. I think that that's a very weak hypothesis. Fascistic societies are fascistic at every single level of organization. Spiritually, within the family, within the local community, it's like a holograph. It's the same absolutely everywhere. It's not top down. I mean, there are leaders who get produced and maybe they catalyze it, but to blame it on the leaders is to forget about the process by which the leaders come to be. So no, you don't get a pass that way. So here's one of the things that happened. As the Nazis started to lose the war. So here's what you should have done if you were a Nazi and you wanted to win the war. You should have enslaved the Jews and the Gypsies and had them work, right? You should have had them work for the benefit of the victory, and then if you wanted to, you liquidate them afterwards. That's the logical thing to do if you want to win. And we assume that Hitler wanted to win. But that's not a very intelligent assumption. Why would you assume that? He wasn't exactly a good guy. So why should we assume that he was aiming at the good that he was promoting, even in his own terms, right? The glorious, everlasting Third Reich, right? That'll rule for 1,000 years and be a bastion of civilization and music, because that's the sort of thing he purported to be interested in. Well, so what do you do with the Jews and the Gypsies? Well, round them up, fine. Enslave them, fine. You don't kill them. You certainly don't devote a substantial proportion of your war resources while you're losing to accelerate the rate at which the extermination is taking place. Because that's a bit counterproductive, unless what you're aiming at is the maximum possible mayhem in the shortest period of time. Well, so what happened as the Germans started to lose the war? Did Hitler lose faith in his own ability? No, he believed that the Germans had betrayed him with weakness. And so he was perfectly willing to accelerate the rate at which Germany was losing the war. And so when Hitler and his minions had the choice, here's the choice. You can suspend your unnecessary demolition of people, win the damn war, and then pick it up afterwards. Or while you're losing, you can just accelerate the mayhem even though it's counterproductive. It's like, what'd they pick? Well, they picked to accelerate the mayhem. And so to me, there's an old psychoanalytic idea. I think this was derived by Jung. If you can't figure out what someone is doing or why, look at the outcome and infer the motivation. If it produces mayhem, perhaps it was aiming at mayhem. Now, you have to use that dictum carefully. If someone's irritating you, maybe it's because you're irritable and you should sort yourself out, but maybe it's because they're actually aiming at irritating you. And that's the actual motivation. So perhaps not, but it's another tool in your analytical armament. So, and so you see, well, and this is the thing about warfare that's so interesting about because you can attribute it to territoriality. You can attribute it to a war for resources. That's what I would say, wretchedly simple-minded economists presume. People fight over scarce resources. It's like, hey, we're a little bit more sophisticated than that. And first of all, what resources are you talking about? The bloody Inuit had nothing. They lived perfectly well. What did they have? Snow and seal blubber. People can live in unbelievably deprived conditions. And so the idea that there are natural resources that we fight over because there's a shortage of them is a pretty oversimplified view of human beings. It's like, well, why do people fight? Well, maybe they fight sometimes for good reasons. But very, very frequently they fight for bad reasons. And those bad reasons are personal as well as sociocultural and economic. If you were a Nazi prison guard, for example, whatever pathologies you were carrying around in your destructive little soul, whatever element of Cain was deeply embedded in you, had the opportunity to be manifest fully at every moment of your waking existence, right? You had these people who were completely beholden to you with no rights whatsoever, to whom you could do whatever your evil little heart determined. Think, well, maybe that was a motivation for putting them there to begin with. And all the cover story about, well, we're trying to build the Third Reich and we're trying to stabilize the state and we're trying to do all these good things. Maybe that's just a cover story for the real motivation, which is nothing but what? The construction of death camps that killed 6 million people. How about that? And the obliteration of 120 million people on the planet, and the leaving of Europe in ruins. Maybe that was the motivation. Or are we going to attribute to Hitler the highest possible motives? Say, no, it's an archetypal manifestation of Cain. Now, he's going to put up a front that says, well, I'm your savior. It's like, well, destructive people think that Cain is their savior. The good estimates are that the Russians killed about 30 million of their own people between 1919 and 1959. And it's brutal. It's brutal. A lot of that was through starvation. I saw a photograph the other day which I tweeted, which is the worst photograph I've ever seen in my life, and that's actually saying a lot, because I've seen a lot of really terrible photographs because I've done so much investigation into totalitarianism. This was a photograph that was taken during one of the early starvation periods in the Soviet Union, where about 3 million peasants died. It was a picture of a peasant couple standing behind a table at a market selling human body parts for food. It's like, and I have this weird quirk, which I don't think does me much good, but maybe helps me understand things better. When I see that someone has done something extreme, I learned to do this a long time ago when I worked briefly in a maximum security prison. I try to imagine what I would have to be like, what kind of situation I would have to find myself in to do that. And believe me, man, that's a horrifying enterprise, because it is actually possible, no matter what it is that you read about someone doing, and no matter how unlikely it is that you think you would do that, It's possible to imagine yourself in that situation, and well, that's enlightening. That's what I would say. That's enlightening, you know, because one of the things about enlightenment is that you get enlightened by doing things that are necessary that you really, really, really do not want to know, don't want to do. And imagining yourself as a perpetrator of that sort that tells you something about the world, and it tells you something about human beings, but it's a hell of a thing to swallow, you know, and in a very well structured society like ours, where we're so peaceful, well, because we have the heat and it always works, and we have electricity and it always works, and we have plumbing, which is a bloody miracle, and it always works. You know, it's just one of the things that this imagination process has done for me is keep me alert to the absolute miracle that my life is every day. It's horribly cold out there. You can't grow any food. You'll die if you're out there for 24 hours. If any of this infrastructure was unreliable for any length of time, we would be in serious trouble. And it's never unreliable. It's so unlikely. And so here we are with all this reliable infrastructure. And because of that, we don't really have to compete with each other much. I mean, some. You don't compete for food. You don't compete for shelter, or some people do, but not very many. So it's really easy to think of yourself as good, because, well, you're not doing anything nasty to anyone. But, you know, a cynic might say, well, that's just because you don't have any reason to. But those reasons have arisen many times in the past, and in fact they're the norm, not the exception. We're the exception. This insanely functional society that we've somehow managed to generate it's incomprehensible to me that it exists. And so Pinocchio is left without the guidance of conscience, and the cricket is trying to figure out how to get off Pleasure Island. But he goes through the gates and he sees what's actually going on. And what's going on is that the coachman has this like slave boat down in the bowels of the island, and he's got all these black suited minions with the glowing eyes working for him, and they're rounding up what look like donkeys. And so they're beasts of burden, right? And so there's an idea here that if you pursue impulsive pleasure to the detriment of the development of your character, you're going to end up a beast of burden. You're going to end up a slave to a tyrant. And that's exactly right. And so anyways, the cricket doesn't, you can see one of those black suited horrors here hauling donkeys out of this crate, and one of them has a hat on, and they look very sad, and they're in different crates, and one of them says sold to the salt mines, and one says sold to the circus, and so they're shipped off to be slaves, roughly speaking, and they look very sad. And then one of them gets hauled out of a crate, and he's still got a hat, he has a hat on and a sweater, and he can still talk. He's a boy, it turns out, that's been half transformed into a jackass, a braying jackass, prior to being enslaved. And so that's another thing that's quite interesting about the story. You know, it also makes the case that if you replace your voice with stupid braying, that the probability that you're going to become enslaved by a tyrant is extraordinarily high. And I always can't help but think about ideologues in that manner. You know, Solzhenitsyn wrote about the radical left ideologues that got thrown in the Gulag Archipelago. You know, so they were party stalwarts. This happened to a lot of people. True believers who were vacuumed up by the Stalinist machine and thrown into the Gulag anyways. And he said that those people suffered in some ways more than everyone else, because, what did he say? They were bit by the beloved hand that fed them. And so the first while when they were in the camps, Solzhenitsyn really didn't know what to do with people like that, because on the one hand, well, they were in the camps and wasn't that awful, and they've been torn away from their families and, you know, stripped of all their identity and their status, and so that's pretty rough. But on the other hand, they were writing letters protesting their innocence and assuming that everyone else in the camp was guilty, but they were innocent, and they were still strident believers in the communist process. And so, you know, it was a conundrum. Here they are being terribly punished, but by the same token they're also the perpetrators of their own demise. So how do you deal with them? And they used to play comrades. He said they used to play comrades with people like that and invite them into an ideological discussion about the camp situation and the situation in the country as a whole, and let them rattle out their ideological justifications for everything that had happened, in trying to make them parody themselves, roughly speaking. It was a rough game. And Solzhenitsyn also concluded that there was no helping someone like that when they were still ensconced inside that braying ideology. You could predict everything they were going to say. It's like someone had a crank. You could just crank it and out would come the proper ideological formulas. But then he realized that as soon as they, let's call it, repented of that and started to realize their own role in it, or the error of the system, then he would start communicating with them, as if they were people who you could communicate with. Yeah. So that was very interesting as far as I'm concerned. Anyways, this kid is still a little bit human. He starts to cry for his mom, and the coachman basically throws him back into the crate and says that he's not ready yet. And the reason for that is that he still had the power of independent speech. You remember, right at the beginning of the movie, when the mouth was painted on Pinocchio, we saw that mask that was really glaring at the process. And I said that character recurs continually throughout the movie, and this is a good example of that, because the coachman is the enemy of anything that has its own voice. So he's the anti-Geppetto. That's a good way of thinking about it. He's the tyrannical aspect of the culture. But insofar as one of these mostly donkeys, mostly jackasses can still talk, then they're not completely fit for slavery. And you remember this movie was also being made at about the same time that the Nazi transformation of Germany was taking place. And so all these terrible underground things, this process whereby people were being reduced to ideological slaves, say, and in this terrible process that was all playing out in Europe in a very big way. And it's not like people weren't aware of that, it was in the air. So anyways, the donkeys, the jackasses that can still talk, are crying and complaining and repenting, and the coachman turns into a full tyrant again and cracks a whip, if I remember correctly, and says, "You've had your fun and now you're going to pay for it." So the cricket gets word of all this. He gets wind of it. He starts to understand what's happened is that all these bad kids were enticed out onto this island so that they could be enslaved. And he's really taken aback by that, to say the least. But he realizes what's going on, so he runs back to find Pinocchio. And then the scene switches back to the 8-ball bar where Lampwick is drinking beer and complaining about what the conscience said. Because he's kind of guilty and ashamed, but he won't admit it, because he doesn't admit anything. He knows everything. He's not going to admit anything about himself that isn't perfect. He's a real totalitarian in training. And he drinks this beer and he's laughing about the conscience and putting him down. And then he says, well, what does he say exactly? What does he think I am, a jackass or something like that? Maybe that's not the words exactly. And then he grows these ears. And Pinocchio sees that and immediately takes a look at the beer and stops drinking it. And then Lampwick transforms one more time and his face turns into the face of a donkey. And he's laughing still. And then his hands, oh yes, he laughs and he starts to bray like a jackass. And he's horrified by that. And then Pinocchio laughs and the braying comes out as well. And so now they're absolutely horrified. And Lampwick actually figures out what's going on. He figures out that he's been tricked and that he's transforming, and he's completely horrified by it. He becomes conscious of what's happening to him. And there's one particularly, I would say, dramatic scene where his hands have transformed into hooves and he's kicking and leaping around the room in panic, and he comes up to a mirror and sees himself as a jackass, and then he turns around and breaks the mirror. And so he's self-conscious for a moment, then he destroys his capacity for self-consciousness, then he transforms entirely into a jackass. He's farther down the road than Pinocchio, and he comes crawling to Pinocchio to save him and asks that the conscience comes back so that he can get out of this, but of course it's a bit too late. And so then Pinocchio grows jackass ears, and he's absolutely terrified by it as well. He knows what's coming. And the cricket comes back and guides them off Pleasure Island. And so then they end up on a cliff, because this is an island after all, and they have to jump into the unknown, right? Out of this impulsive, adolescent, hedonic playground into the unknown. And that's how they escape. The postmodernists, they're the logical conclusion of the Nietzschean dilemma. God is dead. The value structure collapsed. The specter arises of all value structures collapsing. That's the postmodernist dogma. All value structures have collapsed. They're only there for the purposes of exclusion. They have no intrinsic value. It's a very, very powerful argument. That's why it dominates the universities. That and the fact that it allows people to dispense with their moral responsibility, which is something that's never discussed by the postmodernists. But you have to give the devil his due. What's the problem with postmodernism? Well, if all value structures have collapsed, then there's nothing to do. Because in order to do something, one thing has to be better than another, because otherwise, why do it? And so people who are ensconced in the postmodern tradition are undermined by their own philosophy. They can deconstruct their own deconstruction, in which case they might as well just sit there and do nothing, which would actually be preferable to what they're doing now. So how do they extract themselves from that dilemma? They do it illogically, but they don't care. Because the postmodernists, first of all, don't believe in logic. That's a reflection of the logos, which they've dispensed with. Dialogue they don't believe in, because that's a reflection of the logos, which they've dispensed with. Logic and dialogue are irrelevant. Well, that does bring up the problem of what to do. Well, the postmodernists finesse that by reverting to the Marxist doctrines from which postmodernism emerged. And so they say, well, yeah, you can't get any direction from postmodernism, but we're not going to worry about that because we don't worry about such things. What we'll do is just use sleight of hand to push forward the communitarian doctrines out of which our original hypothesis emerged. And everyone says, well, we'll turn a blind eye to the paradox because we actually need something to do. And plus, to the degree that we're communitarian, we can take out our nihilistic resentment and arrogance and ingratitude on every single person we deem to have something more than we have. And so if you're wondering why certain values can exist in the absence of any value, you have to look no farther than to understand that people who are desperate and chaotic will still be angry and destructive. And they can manifest that perfectly with the moral mask that says, well, I'm not really after what you have, because you have a little more than me. I'm speaking on behalf of these people who have even less. It's absolute nonsense. It's so funny watching Yale students complain about the privileged. They're in the top 1/10 of 100% of people who've lived in the entire history of the planet, much less just the people that are on the planet now. They're dominating patriarchs in training, right? They're baby representatives of the patriarchy. And all they do is complain about that tiny, tiny, infinitesimal fraction of people who have slightly more than they have now. It's appalling. And their idiot professors pat them on the back and send them out the world to do that instead of teaching them how to live. They damage their mental health. They hurt our society. They're bringing things down, and that's what they're aiming at. The postmodernists managed to be nihilistic and totalitarian at the same time, which is something that not even Nietzsche dreamed about, despite the fact that he had the greatest imagination for pathology that perhaps ever existed. In addition, they combine the nihilism and the totalitarianism with the worst aspects of dogmatic religion, because what they've essentially established is a cult into which children who attend university are now indoctrinated, at great cost, I might add, and with very little practical outcome. And human beings are in principle made in the image of that logos. And that's why we can speak things into being. And we do. And when you speak truth, then you speak paradise into being, and when you speak falsely, you speak hell into being. And that's the truth. And what that means is that with every decision that you make, you decide for yourself and for everyone else whether you're going to tilt the world a little bit more towards hell or a little bit more towards heaven. And that's the burden you bear for your existence and the choices that you make as you pass through life. And it's the fleeing from that that's at the bottom of the nihilism of postmodernism and the escape into the totalitarian certainties of idol worship. And none of this is fictional, because we've seen the consequences. Jonathan said, quoting, I don't remember the source, that there could be no poetry after Auschwitz. But that's wrong. But the poetry has to be about Auschwitz. The lesson from Auschwitz was never again. And fair enough, but you can't decide not to repeat something terrible unless you understand it. And the way to understand it is that the small sins of each individual culminate in the great sins of the state. And so when you ask why terrible things happen in the world, the answer is quite simple. The answer is it's because you're not good enough. And it's because you don't tell the truth. And you know it. Jonathan said something I thought was very interesting. It's something I've thought about, but I haven't talked to him about it at all. What happens as you move towards the truth? And the answer is everything comes together. That really is the answer, is everything comes together. There's even a sexual element to that, because of course the highest element of sexual ecstasy is to come together. And around someone who's telling the truth, everything comes together, and that's the potential destiny of the world. It's something that you can partake in. It's the call to the greatest adventure that there is. You can bring forth something akin to paradise by speaking the truth, and you can start in your own life, and you can start in the life of your own families, and these are people in principle that you love, and so why would you do anything but speak the truth to them? To protect them from reality? There's no protecting anyone from reality. Reality just is. You interact with it on its terms, and you do that by facing it forthrightly. And you do that by not shying away from the challenge. I spent a lot of time trying to understand the Sermon on the Mount. It's a very strange document. I'm going to tell you what I think it means. It means conceptualize the highest good that you can. And so you might think that would be the highest good for you, and it would be the highest good for the family around you that you love, and it would be the highest good for that family in the state, and it would be the highest good for the state in the world. And that would be the highest possible good. Aim at that, even though you don't know how. Aim at that. Make that what you want. And then tell the truth. And it's an adventure because you don't know what's going to happen. You have no idea, because if you treat things instrumentally, if you treat people instrumentally, you use them as tools for your own desire. And the problem with that is, what do you know about what you desire? Many things that you chase will turn out to be empty. Well, what happens if you just tell the truth? Well, the world will unfold around you in very strange and mysterious ways, and there isn't anything that's more exciting than that, and it's perhaps something exciting enough so that the suffering that's attendant on being would redeem itself by that adventure. And that's the call. That's the Western call to the individual. The suffering of being can redeem itself through truth. And it's not a rule. It's not a proposition that you need to adhere to like a good citizen. It's the proper way of wending your way through the terrible world without making it worse than it already is, and with the possibility perhaps of making it better. There's no more exciting possibility than that, and no higher moral demand. And the thing is everyone knows it. You know when you lie according to your own conception of the truth, that there's something shameful and demeaning about that, and you know that it hurts people. And you think, well, why do you do it? Despite all that, and partly you do it because it's easy. And partly you do it because there's a crooked, horrible, hellish part of your soul that's more than happy if part of what you do is make everything worse to pay for the sin of its existence.